Christian. And this is recorded also now. So, Christian, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction. Dear colleagues from Dalam, again, I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today on the topic of German Arctic and other decolonization efforts. You probably already suspected that this would be a rough ride due to the topic and, of course, my imperfect English skills. However, I've tried to make it easier for you to understand the topic, which was also surprisingly complex for me, by dividing my presentation into 4 thematic blocks. These are a brief overview of German colonial history, a longer overview of the colonial debate in the German state from 1920 to 2020, the decolonization activities in the field of polar metadata of the Archive for German Polar Research, or short ADP, and its effort to make the relevant German professional communities aware of Dalam and its work in the last 2 years. If you have questions during my presentation, I would be happy to answer them at the end. But so much for the preliminary remarks. Let us now go straight into the subject and turn to German colonial history. German colonies, often officially called protectorates, were appropriated by the German Empire from the 1880s and ceded after the First World War in accordance with the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. In 1914, the German colonies were the 3rd largest colonial empire in terms of area after the British and the French. In terms of population, it was in the 4th place after the Dutch colonies. Since the first German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, was hesitant to acquire colonies, it took more than a decade for the German Empire, after its foundation, to decide to acquire any. It was in line with this caution that the German colonies never were part of the Reich's territory, but its overseas possessions. There were several rebellions in German colonies against German rule, which were rather bloodily suppressed. In German Southwest Africa, the German colonial rulers committed in 1904 genocide against the Herero and Nama, the first genocide of the 20th century to be recognized in historiography. During the suppression of the Maji-Maji uprising from 1905 to 1907, in what was then in German East Africa, around 75,000 to 300,000 people lost their lives as a result of a scorched earth policy. In 1914, just before the World War I, the German colonial empire encompassed parts of today's Republic of China, Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, Mozambique, Namibia, Cameroon, Gabon, the Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, Chad, Nigeria, Togo, Ghana, Papua New Guinea, and several islands in the West Pacific and Micronesia. Emigrant German founded settlements overseas too, which were sometimes referred to as German colonies, but did not exercise the sovereign rights of the country of origin. Since the final loss of the colonies in the 1920s, there have been repeated debates about Germany's colonial past. According to the colonial historian Christian Konrad, on whose article The Return of the repressed, the memory of colonialism in Germany 1919 to 2019, on which I will mainly refer in this section. They depended on certain conditions. Quotation, under which colonial issues found resonance with a wider audience. Whenever German colonialism became a political and public issue, it was, as Conrad continues, not only about the colonial path itself, but rather social changes and German new roles in the world were also negotiated. Quotation ended. The dynamics of these debates were increasingly influenced by other actors and voices. That is, from historians and other researchers from former colonies in neighboring European countries and in the US. According to Conrad, the politics of remembrance today does not take place in a closed national space, but it is a transnational phenomenon. With this knowledge, it is possible to broadly distinguish three phases or cycles of remembrance policy interest in German colonial history, namely the colonial revisionism of the interwar period, the criticism of imperialism of the 1960s, and the broader, still ongoing discussion since the end of the Cold War. In the Weimar Republic, the second German democracy, which existed from 1919 to 1933, and Nazi Germany, colonial revisionist positions that did not want to accept the end of the colonial empire were widespread, found support across party lines until 1933, and were promoted through propaganda by the Nazi government. That revisionism aimed at a return of the colonies and continuation of imperialist policies. Even though in the Weimar Republic, colonial policy issues remained a marginal phenomenon overall and were less relevant than other foreign policy issues, colonial patterns of interpretations and racist idea were still widespread and reproduced by colonial literature, for instance, and had an effect on society, as can be seen from the example of the discussion about the occupation of parts of the Ruhr area by colonial troops in 1923. In this way, colonial claims and discourses continues to have an effect. Although in the 1920s, German social democrats and communists did critical positions on German colonialism and imperialism, albeit only at the political fringes. On the basis of the existing patterns of interpretation from the Weimar Republic and reinforced by propaganda and movies, for instance, the discussion about the return of the colonies was continued in Nazi Germany, although they were no longer in the foreground. Regime's foreign and conquest policy was directed primarily towards areas in the European East, and plans for acquisitions in Africa were finally shelved in 1943, for obvious reasons, of course. Therefore, after the end of the war, it could also appear as if the imperialist phase of German history was long over. While other European colonial powers were involved in sometimes lengthy and bloody disputes over the end of colonial rule in the decades following 1945. The two German states, that is the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, do not feel affected by this issue. This impression was not due, not least to the fact that the National Socialist expansion in Eastern Europe was not interpreted as colonization, even if it did not differ significantly from it in terms of intentions of permanent occupation and foreign rule. The Second World War, and above all the period of occupation, put an end to all efforts to establish territorial and colonial rule. From the 1950s, the West German and the East German state therefore regarded the colonial era as finally concluded. However, colonial patterns of perception and thought continued to have an effect and found expression in the foreign policy of the young Federal Republic of Germany, in the substitute field of development aid, which was directed at the former German colonies. In the 1960s, after a phase in which the topic was not very prominent, both German states began to engage with the topic of colonialism again, this time from a critical perspective. The background to this was the increasing pace of decolonisation during this period, which, under the heading of neocolonization, led to a critical review of European relations with new post-colonial states. As a result, the public in East Germany, but also in West Germany, discussed the country's colonial past. For the first time, especially in East Germany, historians systematically and critically researched this past on the basis of historical sources and with the then modern social historical approach. However, the results of this work of remembrance were also used for political purposes in both states. In East Germany, they served to distinguish the country from imperialism, that is, from late capitalism according to the historical understanding of Marx. At the same time, neocolonialism was considered to be of little significant for the East German state because it was a state supported by the working class. Quotation. Instead, the critical appraisal of colonialism could be instrumentalized as a way of opposing the neighboring capitalist state, from which one had to protect oneself with an anti-imperialist protective wall at the border. Quotation end. In West Germany, it was mainly the New Left that took up this topic and used it for its fundamental criticism of the capitalist system and neo-imperial world order. They saw the liberation movements of the Third World as possible protagonists for a world revolution, and thus as an important part in an quotation alternative to the strategy of the socialist and communist parties, which continued to rely on the European working class as a revolutionary subject. Quotation end. In addition, the coming to terms with National Socialism provided a further framework in which the colonial era was also acquired significance. For example, the West German left criticized the USA-Vietnam policy by drawing on the National Socialist past, while in the GDR, Hannah Arendt's thesis, formulated as early as in 1951, was used to provide the origin of the National Socialist policy of extermination could be found in the genocide against the Herero and Nama in the war of 1904 to 1907. Left-leaning forces in West Germany and, of course, in East Germany used the colonial past as a weapon in the system conflict of the time, or in intergenerational debate on social reforms. Nevertheless, typical narratives of German colonialism had an impact that went beyond this historical context of the 1968 movement. They were recalled, for example, in parts of the anti-globalization movement of the 1990s. A third phase of the development of colonial memory in Germany began with the end of the Cold War. It was marked by the globalization, meaning the integration of the world through financial and goods markets, as well as the internet and the associated global imagination. This process, combined with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and the associated farewell to the bipolar world of the post-war period, had significant consequences for the politics of memory, meaning the politics of how societies, here the German, remember and commemorate the past. It made a new narrative of these politics necessary. In the case of Germany, this meant that the Second World War and the Holocaust no longer dominated public memory, as I had in the decades before, but were increasingly joined by references that rather thematized Germany's historical positioning in the world. The beginning of this change were initially noticeable on a small scale. For example, in municipal initiatives to rename streets after advocates of German colonialism, such as Karl Peters, also known as Hank Peters for his cruelty towards the East African population. Since the beginning of the 21st century, colonial issues have received even more attention, especially after the 9/11 attacks, which also made it clear to the German public the need to engage with global issues. This development was due, on the one hand, to the fact that a quarter of the German population had a migrant background and therefore had no connection to the traditional national history. Representatives of these population groups were able to publicly assert the demands for colonial memory work and alternative identificational reference. On the other hand, the politics of memory was increasingly discussed nationally by a large number of actors. Thus, voices from the former colonies gradually found an audience in these discussions, albeit only in the initial stages. This development can be seen particularly well in the class action lawsuit of the Herrera and Nama, which, quotation, asserted claims against the Federal Republic of Germany and individual companies as reparation, or Wiedergutmachung, as the German term goes, for the genocide in present-day Namibia, quotation end. All in all, Conrad comes to the conclusion that the history of remembrance of German colonialism is by no means over. For him, it seems paradoxically to become all the more pressing the longer ago the events to be remembered occurred. He identifies the reason for this in the fact that the corresponding debates on the politics of memory are kind of a magnifying glass, quotation, through which social changes that the transformed role of the Federal Republic in the international context can clearly be seen. Quotation end. In view of the colonial debates of recent decades in Germany, we are probably wondering why the Alfred Wegener Institute, or short RWI, should deal with German colonialism and imperialism, although it was only founded in the 1980s, and therefore at the first glance, had no links to German colonial history. However, the Institute cannot ignore the fact that Wegener's Greenland expedition in 1930 to 1931 was a part of a colonial project in that its meteorological and atmospheric measurements were intended to help answer the question of whether a permanent airship connection from Europe across the Arctic to, for example, the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, would be possible. Furthermore, the Institute cannot brush aside the fact that, if not Wegener himself, that at least in the biographies of at least 3 expedition members, colonial and even racist, meaning anti-Semitic patterns of perceptions, thought, and action can be found. How, you may ask, is the Institute dealing with this? That is the colonial legacy of polar and marine research today, of German polar and marine research today. The answer to these questions lies in the way the research institution treats the memories of the Inuit who worked for Wegener on his expedition. In mid-2019, a rare, almost unique opportunity arose for the RWE to break new ground in its own institutional politics of memory, when it decided to name its technical center after Rasmus Willumsen, an Inuit member of Alfred Wegener's last Greenland expedition in 1913 to 1931, because of its great services to Wegener. It was Willumsen who accompanied Wegener on his return journey from the Eismitte station to the West station at the Greenlandic west coast in the cold and stormy November 1930. And after Wegener's death on the way there, it was he who buried Wegener with dignity and set off for the west coast of Greenland with his diary to inform the crew of the West Station about Wegener's fate. However, Willumsen never arrived there and was never found. He is therefore considered lost to this day. In view of this achievement, of his achievements, the RWE honoring of him was long obvious, and therefore the Institute invited his relatives to the laying of the foundation stones and opening of the technical center, and presented them with a replica of the pocket watch that Wegener had promised Willumsen for his services. And this event gave the RW Archive, otherwise known as ADP, simultaneously the specific cause to turn to its holdings relating to Greenlandic Inuit. Together with 1 or 2 user cases from Kalalunat, Willumsen's honoring led to the questions in the ADP as to whether the indexing results for the papers of Wegener and his German colleagues, but also for other holdings with a connection to Greenland, took the Inuit mentioned there adequately into account. Helpful in answering these questions was the fortunate fact that the RWE joined the University of the Arctic in 2017, and that the Institute's library, to which the ADP belongs organizationally, had been a member of the Polar Library Colloquy since 2000. It was therefore easy for the ADP to join the Dalam network at the end of 2022, and to get from there in the following at least inspiration and ideas on the problem I mentioned above. So, since 2022, the ADP, inspired by Dalam, has been working on the question of how the contact and interaction of Nunat representatives with German polar researchers on their expeditions can be made identifiable in the existing finding aids, meaning the online database, the inventory classifications, the place, person, and subject indexes. The RVE archive is endeavoring to find answers to further questions, namely, which of the relevant terms as metadata also take into account the Kalalit perspective, whether new conceptual solutions are necessary, and if so, whether and to what extent they are respectful towards Inuit and understandable for other users. The archive is also concerned with the scientific historical question of how the actual population of today's Kalalit Nunat perceived German polar researchers in the early 20th century. This new approach has already led to the Inuit perspective as well as that of other peoples being taken into account in the local, personal, and subject indices of the ADP's working database, and soon also of its internet database, and in particular in its latest product, the Polar Explorers Catalog. Specifically, the place names of the Kalalit people were added to the place index in the archive database, and these place names were written after the places names from the colonial period. In this way, the Inuit perspective is taken into account in this register, while the colonial view is retained for researchers' purposes. The change of individual data sets with culturally difficult indexing results in the database. In the title information, for example, is still pending, but will be addressed in the near future. The ADP Polar Research Catalog already contains 3 entries on indigenous scientists, namely Anna Hulukwak, Knut Rasmussen, and Tokolito. The ADP's as yet incomplete efforts to decolonize its metadata have already led, and this is the real news, to its descriptive information being enriched by Inuit and other cultural perspective, and to the archive holding also becoming more usable for members of these cultures. Although the German language in which the RVE archive finding aids and the catalog entries are written still represent a main obstacle for these users. In addition to its own decolonization efforts, the ADP also advocated the institutionalization of the idea of decolonization metadata from libraries and archives, as the archive agreed more 2 years ago to examine the possibilities of expanding Dalam in Germany. To this end, the ADP was asked by Dalam to examine whether other initiatives, working groups, networks for metadata, decolonization, or similar already exist in the German archiving sector. Whether there is an interest and cooperation on decolonization metadata here, and whether there is an interest in the German archiving community in founding a German Dalam group. To answer this question, the ADP developed activities listed on the list and the following slides. Here on the German Archive Day in Suhl last year, here in an article in the Berlin Archive Review. And only 10 days ago, in the presentation of this Dalam network at the March meeting of the Bremen Archive Working Group. Feedback from events of the ranks of the German, the Association of German Archivists in 2024 was rather poor, but only by numbers. In fact, the few responses were enough to make Dalam known in the Republic and to initiate connections to German decolonization networks. My contact with Thorsten Musiel resulted in my article on Dalam in the Berlin Archive Review, for example. Shortly after my contribution to Dalam at the Archive Day in Suhl last year, Annette Bresan, the director of the Sorbian Cultural Archive in Bautzen, which is in Southeast Germany, approached me and asked for information about Dalam. She wants to demonstrate to cultural politicians and archive authorities in Saxony that the Sorbian language also need to be included in the finding aids of the state's archives institute. Following the publication of the article, librarian and ethnologist Moritz Strickert from the Humboldt University Library and from the Netzwerk kolonialer Kontexte finally contacted Dalam. This network, so I'm told, has a working group, Sauri, which is in the process of developing a global thesaurus for cultural groups based on data from the Gemeinsame Normdatei, short GND, and vocabularies from various institutions in the GLAM field. It is also in the process of linking their work with the art and architecture thesaurus AAT and Wikidata. This contact may give Dalam access to important German decolonization networks, such as the Colonial Provenance Working Group of the Arbeitskreis Provenienzforschung or the Coordination Center for University and Scientific Collections. In my view, we could use these contacts to find out more about German efforts to decolonize library or archive metadata, and, if necessary, work together with the networks mentioned. Although, according to my information, all these bodies are scarcely known in the German archivist scene, and that the GND is not very famous for its polar geographical entries. To conclude my presentation, I would like to summarize it with a few theses. Namely, Germany has a complex and mostly cruel colonial history. The public discourse on this matter in the past depended on colonial and racist pattern of thought and perception, their dissemination in public, the resulting and thus reinforcing effects in society, and later increasingly also the influence of political ideologies, historical research, and migrant and transnational actors. Third, the Alfred Wegener Institute is facing up to the colonial past of German polar and marine research. Fourth, its archive has begun to decolonize its metadata and the history of German and polar and maritime research. And fifth, there are decolonization networks in the German GLAM scene, and it seems worthwhile for Dalam to get in touch with them. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christian. That sounded great, really interesting. I have so many questions.
Go on.
Well, but first, does anyone else have questions or comments?
Well, I'd like to say it's thank you, Christian. It was so impressive and so interesting. So that's great. Thanks.
Yes, for me it was also quite interesting because I haven't followed the discussion about the colonial history in the recent past, and it was for me very interesting to see how the debate began and how it changed over time, and where we at the moment, or where we were in 2020.
Does anybody else have questions or comments?
I have a question, Sandy, if I may. I was just interested, Christian, are you working with the library in Bremerhaven, or?
Yes. The head librarian is my boss, and the archive is part of the Institute's library here in Bremerhaven.
So are you able to kind of join forces and decolonize the metadata in the library at the same time, or would that be two different projects?
I would deem that it would be different projects, and because I work solely for the archive, and have just begun the decolonization work, and it will take the library sometimes to follow and develop its own ideas, and so we will. But we will both at a certain time join forces, and I think the library can rely on my experience on decolonization of metadata.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions?
It was a rough ride.
So Christian, you may be aware that in Canada, we had our Truth and Reconciliation process about 15 or so years ago. And after that, we sort of became aware of how the education systems had not ever addressed the colonial issues in Canada, particularly things around residential schools and the treatment of Indigenous people. And all of us who had been through the system became aware of the fact that there was a great gap in what we had been taught. And I'm wondering, in your education, your personal education, growing up, I presume in Germany, was colonial history taught at all in the schools? And did you get any of that did people have any of that sense of oppression of people, or was it taught totally from the colonial perspective?
I think I was taught from the 1960s perspective. I was taught the development of German colonialism as well as imperialism, and but on a way it was a preparation preparation for the contents that came later, meaning the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And for my teachers, I think it was only these necessary steps to Nazi Germany and the genocide committed by the Germans at that time.
Right. So
and I think in the first decade of this century, things changed a bit. I gave you several pictures of the situation in Bremen, because for a certain reason Bremen was one of the centers of German colonialism, and from Bremen University, from grassroots groups, and even from a theater, the Shakespeare Company in Bremen, there was sort of a movement to not only to describe history, but also to show that there are, on the one side, the rulers, the colonial rulers, and on the other side, the victims of colonial rule, and hinting at the same time that these victims were also trying to rebel against colonial rules, and so from a more from a broader perspective, leaving out all the actors in colonial history, they come to the actors and their biographies, and we are able now to name them and to understand how and why why and how they act, why and how they have acted. Sorry.
Right. Thank you. Does anyone else have questions? I don't want to sort of hog all of the time. I have a further question about Willemsen. You said that he died, or that he left towards the coast and was never found. So how do we know that? I don't know this history. So how do we know that that's what happened to him?
When we talk about Wegener, his grave indeed was found by his collaborators in spring 1931, and there was a note from Willemsen saying that he buried Wegener and that he will head for the west coast, and they seem to have opened the grave, and they had to look if it was Wegener who was buried there, and so they find everything, and they well, and from their findings, they concluded that Willemsen had died somewhere between the Wegener's grave and the west coast, but in fact he has never been found to the present day.
Right. Thanks so much. Peter, did you have a question? No. All right. So another question back to Peter's question, actually. Recognizing that you're an archivist, I'm wondering if you have any sense or any information about you've given us a great overview of what's going on in decolonization in archives, but I'm wondering if you have any sense of the library side or even the museum side about whether or not decolonization is sort of present as a theme and an activity in libraries and museums as well in Germany.
As for libraries, I would like you to ask Moritz Stückert from the Library of Humboldt University. And as far as it comes to museums, I can say there's a lot of provenance research underway at the moment in Germany, and which led to giving back colonial cultural items robbed by the colonial rulers, and even such terrible items like skulls from an chief of the Herero was given back here from the Overseas Museum in Bremen, and they are really trying to they're trying to do as much as research work they can do, because it still is, and it was, and I don't know what will be the future like, but it was the political, the expectation among German politicians to sort the things out. And what the future will bring, I cannot say, but the provenance research work in German museums are still underway.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions? Anyone thought of another question? Okay, I have one more, if I may. All of us who collect in northern or Arctic collections have materials from a variety of different groups of people. But wherever we are located in one place. So for our collection in Edmonton, we're not even in an Inuit community. But when we all come to work with these collections, we now try very hard to work with the people either who produce those collections or about whom those collections are written. So we all face this question of, when we say nothing about me without me, we are actually, most of us, without almost all of the cultures around whom we collect. And you are completely, I presume, without those cultures around you. So I'm wondering if there's an awareness of the sort of nothing about me without me process and that need, and if anyone in Germany is coming up with methods of kind of including the Indigenous perspective for the various cultures around whom they collect.
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting question, and which I can only answer the way that at least the Alfred Wegener Institute tries to establish bonds to the Greenlanders. As you can see by the fact that we invited the relatives of Rasmus Willemsen to the for instance, to the opening of our technical center. And personally, I would like to go to Greenland one day and to have first a nice chat, and then an interview in terms of oral history to get to know how the Inuit thoughts were about Wegener and its expedition at that time, on Wegener himself and on certain of his comrades and so on. And it's of course a very time-consuming process, but I would at the end I would really like to see that we can depict the views of the Inuit in our catalogs and in our finding aids, in our descriptions of our data sets and so on. And I really try to go to Greenland and offer them even some document with mainly referring to German polar research, but also are focusing on the Inuit living at Greenland, let's say in the 1930s. And what in my experience, what is really appreciated is first of all the fact that we are recognizing the achievement of Inuit people, and that we are willing to share our documents with the people over there, and who I don't know. Perhaps we will be appreciate a bit longer, and we will come to a closer cooperation. That's what I would really like to see, and what I'm working for.
Right. We do have a Boletta Olson, I think her last name is, someone can correct me if I'm wrong with that, who is in Nuuk as a contact. She's a part of the organization. And of course...
I think I know her.
Right. And then, of course, the Danish libraries are also working closely on those issues. So it makes me think that maybe for Greenlandic issues, there might be a way of having like a subgroup within DALM or within Polar Libraries Colloquy to work on developing on terminology for Greenlandic subject headings, because of course they're going to be the source, and maybe DALM we could, for various libraries that have Greenlandic content that need to improve their subject headings, we might be able to work with them somehow. I know that Boletta has many hats, and is always, her time is very tight. So, but there might be others there who would be willing to work with us on that as well.
I would think this is a good idea, and I would like to work with this within this subgroup, because it's so close to our collections that and of course my time is also limited. So I think when we join forces, we can move things a bit further in this matter.
Right. Well, we're almost out of time here. Susanna, is there anything else that we need to...
Yeah, there was a question from Nadine in the beginning in the chat. Christian, are we okay to share with interested colleagues this recording?
Yes, you can share it, and I will anyway send my presentation to you in order to put it in the Dalam library, so it can be also can be read, of course.
Thank you. Thank you. And then there was Lisa trying to say something, and she wrote about the terminal tube work in Greenland. Would you like to say something, Lisa?
No, actually, my question, Sandy actually asked a big chunk of it. And I will say though that there's a lot of terminology work happening, but it's in Kalaallisut, because that's the language of Kalaallit So there's a lot of that work happening. It's just not in a language that that we, at least that I am fluent in. And for Christian, thank you for the presentation. In your place name, do you refer to Greenland as Kalaallit Nunaat though, or solely Greenland?
I would. I thought I changed it, but I would refer mainly to Kalaallit Nunaat, because
yeah, like in the database.
Because it's so in where? Sorry.
In the database.
Yes. I've already take the term into the geographical index.
Yeah, just because in terms of like search finding, if you're in, if you are in Kalaallit Nunaat, that's what you're going to search, and so it'll help just get visibility, even if the results are in German, it will still pick it up in.
Yeah. Yes. But if they want, they can find Nuuk. They can also find the Kamayuruk, and so on and so on. I left the Kalaallit names and add the names which were existent so far in the indices too.
Yeah, a lot of databases do cities and towns and villages, but forget that the country is not Greenland. It's Kalaallit Nunaat. But thanks very much. That was really interesting.
Apart from this burden of colonial past here, I think. We also say not Copenhagen, but or can say Copenhagen and so on. We also say the Netherlands are not far away from here, not Groningen, but Groningen, and it's not a big issue if you are used to that habit. It's a matter of respect, and we all like to be treated respectfully, and so it's vice versa. We can do it too.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we just got to our time, and Sandy, I think it's just to. The last thing is to note about the next meeting, which will be